Welcome everyone. On behalf of the Friedman Hayek Center and the Center for Free Enterprise, I want to thank you to join this new Freedom Perspectives webinar. Today we are very lucky to have Peter Boettke with us. He doesn't need an introduction. He's very well known. So I will want to mention, of course, he's a university professor of economics and philosophy at George Mason University, former president of the Mont Pelerin Society, author of many books, and today he agreed to talk about his last book, and the most recent one, which is titled The Historical Path to Liberty and Human Progress, co-authored with Rosolino Candela, one of his students and an old friend of mine. So Pete, thank you very much for spending some time with us. I don't want to take any time from you, so go ahead.
Thank you very much, Nico. I'm thrilled to be here and to have this opportunity. And also very thrilled to have learned just recently that you guys will be hosting the Mont Pelerin meeting in 2027. So I'm looking really forward to that. And I think it's very exciting times. So as was explained, this is a co-authored new book with my colleague, Rosolino Candela. It's been a long time since he was my student. He's been my scientific collaborator for over a decade. And this is the product of that collaboration, at least in one angle of it. We also recently published this book, which is, if anyone wants a copy of, just email me at my university address and I'll send you a PDF of. And we have another book that we're doing on price theory as well. So Rosolino and I work a lot. He works at the office, the opposite end of this hall. Anyway, this is a book. It's published by University of Francisco Marroquin Press, and it's dedicated to Manuel Ayau. Manuel Ayau is celebrating. The UFM is celebrating the 100th anniversary of Manuel Ayau's birth this year. He was the founder of the university, and so we are very thrilled to be able to offer this as a part of that tribute to him. So the way my talk's gonna proceed is that I'm gonna introduce you to the puzzle that we're trying to solve, look at the theoretical foundations, the historical insights, the role that property rights and entrepreneurship play, evidence from world history, and then the lessons for liberalism more broadly. If you go back to the title, let me just explain here. The book makes out an argument that the path to liberty is earned through small victories for liberties at earlier stages. And so, when you think about the hockey stick, which you'll see shortly, but, basically economic growth continues like this for many years, millennia, and then all of a sudden it shoots up. That's where economists come in. We want to understand the wealth and poverty of nations. So we're looking at that inflection point. Along this line, there's various different moments in which people are securing rights against the arbitrary subjugation by the crown, by the dogma of the church, all of these various different accumulation of these little liberties that are hard earned and won during this battle. And what happens is that each of the victories make adjacent possible, it's an evolutionary concept, make adjacent possible the next change. And eventually what happens is they get to a point, and it's like a reaching of a tipping point, except it's the opposite of a tipping point, which is basically you move from this all of a sense to a non-scalar transformation, and that's how you get human progress. And so that's basically the argument in a nutshell, if you wanted to get it quick and fast and then go home. But is that our book tries to document that story and make the evidence for that. All right, so let's walk through this. So we quote at the very beginning of the book this great quote by Matt Ridley, and the book in many ways is a continued reflection upon the meaning of this quote, which is that innovation is the child of freedom and the parent of prosperity. So what generates modern economic growth is what needs to be explained. How and why did it happen? We were all poor. We were all poor and sick. And then some of us were able to graduate into being healthy and wealthy. And unfortunately, some still linger behind. And the question is why? And we, through reverse logic of this, we go all the way back to the freedom of the individual. The freedom of the individual is able to innovate, find new discoveries, find new ways of doing things in the arts and in science and in commerce. And this is what, is the foundation building block of economic development. And we're going to find that in property rights. Now, Adam Smith, the original economic development theorist, right? The inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Again, hockey stick, boom, like this. What's going on? Smith argues that this we can go from the lowest forms of barbarism to the highest form of opulence. All that's required is peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. That tolerable administration of justice, you could drive a truck through it trying to figure out what's going on there, and that's what we're trying to bear on. That's going to be the institutions that coordinate decentralized market exchange. Remember, in the very first paragraph of Smith's book, he says that the greatest improvement of mankind is due to the expansion of division of labor. He then puts forth a proposition that division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. So you have to grow the market in order to get refinements of the division of labor. But as you get refinements of division of labor, then that's going to increase the yields that you get from engaging in production and exchange. And so it's a virtuous cycle that happens that grows and leads to the wealth of nations. And unable to realize that leads to the poverty of nations. So we need institutions to coordinate decentralized markets. We need institutions to limit the responsibilities of the sovereign. And we need institutions to institute the liberal plan. That's Smith's term, liberal plan of, and then again, Smith's terms, liberty, equality, and justice. So our argument in this book draws on Deirdre McCloskey's argument, which is basically that liberalism caused the great enrichment. All right. So if you look at the upper left-hand corner graph here, what McCloskey is trying to show you in there is that the gains of efficiency that are gained by increases in the marginal product of labor, all right, that those gains from efficiency are dwarfed by the gains from the greater enrichment. So it can't just be that we've received improvements in our technological improvements in technology or improvements in economic arrangements. So expansion of trade is critical, but it cannot explain the magnitude. Technological innovation is vital, but it cannot explain the magnitude. Capital accumulation is a necessary component, but it cannot explain the magnitude. Legal institutions to protect persons and property are essential, but cannot explain the magnitude. When I say cannot explain the magnitude, I mean cannot explain the magnitude alone. That this is the crucial thing. It's not that these things are not part of the explanation. They're just not the cause of the explanation. In many ways, they're the consequence of the ideas. So what can we attribute it to? It is ideas that accord dignity to commerce and preach about the sanctity of persons and property that explains modern economic growth. It's when we see these ideas matched to these institutions that we see the combustible combination occur in which trade, technology, capital accumulation, and property rights are critical to the expansion of the entrepreneurial market economy. And that's what explains the transformation. The way McCloskey puts it in another book is leave me alone and I'll make you rich. Right? And it is this idea of having the freedom to give it a go, but also the social approbation to give it a go. Adam Smith, in his other great work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, talks about social approbation and social disapprobation. And what we're arguing here is that what McCloskey calls the bourgeois virtues, that is a form of social approbation that is given to people who give it a go, who pursue commerce for a living. Let's see, did I go? Okay. So then what's the drag? So the drag is going to be the problem of the predatory state. So states since antiquity have had this characteristic of being predatory. Adam Smith refers to them as engaging in a juggling trick, the ancient as well as the modern, in which they, through various mechanisms, predate on their population. And this is an ageist puzzle. You can go all the way to 1 Samuel in the Old Testament, where the Hebrews asked God for a king. God responds to them and says, no, you don't really want a king. What that king will do is confiscate your grain, send your sons into war and your daughters into service. And the Israelites respond back, no, 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 we need a king. Lord, please give us a king. And the Lord gives them a king. And what did the king do? He confiscated their grain, sent their sons to war, and enlisted their daughters into service. And so the Israelites complain, Lord, look what the king has done to us. And, the Lord says, yep, see what I told you? So this issue of the ageless problem of the predatory state. But at the same time that we have that, we also have the idea that we also need to have the state. This is why it's a puzzle and a problem, right? Because if the answer was just, okay, so then we don't need the state, then you get rid of the puzzle. But if instead what you do is you need the state, so you need the state to provide the protective state, that is to provide courts, defense, and law enforcement. We need the productive state to provide public goods such as roads, schools, libraries. But in doing this, we also create the predatory state, which is that it concentrates benefits on well-organized special interest groups to benefit and disperse the costs on others in society. And so what we must do is move to the constitutional level of analysis and empower yet constrain. And that's the fundamental puzzle. The countries going back here, they accumulated these liberties over time. That creates an institutional structure, which is largely adopted here. And in that institutional structure, we are able to discharge the sovereign of responsibilities that the sovereign is not to be engaged in. But yet at the same time, we have the sovereign doing the responsibilities, let's say protection of property rights and protection of persons. And that accumulation of those liberties gets embedded into a constitutional regime, which then leads to the great takeoff. That is our thesis that we are trying to explore. What kills that is when the state drags the economy, all right, by being predatory. So how's another way to think about this is that there's two natural proclivities to mankind. One of them was captured in the work of Thomas Hobbes. The other one is captured in the work of Adam Smith. Hobbes argued that our natural propensity as humans is to pillage and plunder others. Smith's natural propensity is for us to truck, barter, and exchange. If we allow ourselves to succumb to the Hobbesian propensities, we are going to engage in raiding, and raiding leads to poverty. If we are instead follow our Smithian propensities, we engage in trading, and trading generates wealth. So what determines the marginal benefits and marginal costs of raiding versus trading? The institutional environment within which you find yourself. And so if we find the institutional environment that curtails raiding and encourages trading, we're actually going to be on the path towards economic development and growth. If we find ourselves opposite, we're going to be trapped in the violence trap, and we won't be able to escape the natural state, which will keep us in a situation of violence and poverty. So what's one of the key institutions that pushes us towards raiding versus trading? It's going to be the security of property rights. So we're going to have institutions that secure enforceable and exchangeable property rights. Now, this is the Economic Freedom Index from 2024, and you can see the countries that are the most free, the ones who are second most free, and then those who are in the third quintile, and then those that are the least free countries in the world. Those are associated with their scores on the security of property rights, sound money, trade, regulatory regime, and whatnot. And so secure is securely strictly defined and strictly enforced, or clearly defined and strictly enforced property rights enable investment, innovation, and market efficiency. They do so by fostering accountability and cooperation, by limiting access and assigning accountability to individuals. Or you could say responsibility, since I used the word earlier. So just use the other word, responsibility, assigning responsibility. They are foundational to economic growth because they generate productive entrepreneurship in trade and in technology. So they are going to be the property rights which determine whether or not I'm going to engage in productive entrepreneurship, evasive entrepreneurship, or destructive entrepreneurship. So what I was talking about raiding, that's destructive entrepreneurship. The captain who's leading the raid is actually very entrepreneurial, but it's in a destructive manner, not in a productive manner. The captain of industry who is trying to pursue a strategy to maximize the effects of trading, that's going to be productive entrepreneurship. So what determines whether or not I'm engaged in productive entrepreneurship or allocate my talents to destructive entrepreneurship is going to be the institutional rules within which we find ourselves operating. So this is the Schumpeterian Kerzner kind of idea. Kerzner has the idea that entrepreneurship is about alertness to opportunities. That's actually going to be about trading, right? Kerzner is about arbitrage and trading. Schumpeter is about creative destruction. That is about innovation. And so one way to think about this is that Kerzner explains why it is that we always get on the production possibility frontier, or have a tendency to, is because we're going to see those gains from trade. And Schumpeter is about how those gains from trade are going to be pushed out through technological innovation. And so Bommel's contribution to this was to determine, whether or not entrepreneurial effort is going to be directed in a Kerznerian or Schumpeterian sense, or it's going to be allocated in this unproductive sense. And so the institutions shape productive or unproductive activity. A really cool paper that gets discussed in here is allocation of entrepreneurial talent. And this is a paper that looks at whether or not in your higher education institutions you produce more lawyers or you produce more engineers. If you're a society which produces more lawyers than engineers, you're most likely a rent-seeking society. If you're a society that produces more engineers, you're more of an innovative commercial society. And so, you can think about that kind of idea. Second one is, if your capital city is the hub of economic activity in your country, well, that tends to signal that you're more rent seeking. Whereas if you look at societies in which second cities and third cities are economic commercial hubs of those societies, those are less politically oriented societies. And so all of this is a function of the institutions under which people are operating. So everyone here is assumed to be responding, the best that they can given their circumstances. And they're going to allocate depending on what the marginal benefit, marginal cost calculus is. That's a function of the institutional environment they find themselves. So I just have a few more slides, and then we'll open it up for all kinds of questions that you might have. But the bourgeois error, McCloskey's idea, as I mentioned earlier, is that you need to have dignity accorded to everyday activities, ordinary individuals. Not extraordinary individuals, but ordinary individuals are accorded dignity for their work, for their efforts in this. And they are given the liberty to then pursue whatever plans for productive activity that they think will pay off. 50% of them don't pay off. Okay. That's important to keep in mind. The right to try is also the responsibility of failing. That's part of the puzzle that needs to be solved is we need a profit and loss system. You can't have just a profit system without a loss system and expect to have economic innovation and activity. You need to have both sides of that equation. So, but dignity is accorded to those who just give it a go, and you have the freedom to give it a go. There's a great book written many years ago by a guy named Reuven Brenner. It's called he wrote this book called Betting on Ideas. And then he wrote a follow-up book, which is about development using that idea called The Labyrinths of Prosperity. And in that book, what he says is that you have to have individuals who are willing to bet on ideas and find the financing to bet on those ideas. Okay. So you need to have both the ability to pursue ideas and to find the financing to be able to put those ideas to test. Now, that requires a certain set of institutions. It requires a certain set of institutions, including risk assessment and everything else that goes with it, which leads to modern capitalism, which is why, the socialist calculation debate is kind of interesting because it's two sides. What socialism can't do, capitalism does every day, which is capitalism can engage in rational economic calculation, whereas socialism is rendered unable to do that. And so that's a subject for a different day. It's this book here. And I recommend it to everyone, and we'll send it to anyone who wants it for free. So, but so these ideas and institutions matter for growth. That's the ultimate line. Now, also in the book, we talk about the 20th century, and the 21st century is upon us now. And we don't talk so much about the 21st century. We talk more about the 20th century experiments with totalitarianism and economic technocracy. But as you all know, liberalism is under threat right now by populist responses, populism, right wing and left wing populist criticisms of a capitalist system. In the United States, this has formed in our current administration, which is nativism and industrial policy in the 21st century. At least that's part of what they're doing. And the reconstruction of liberalism, we argue in the book. In the book, we have a chapter on liberalism in crisis, which talks about the 1930s and 40s. And the arguments of the time that were being made at that time. But in the wake of the reconstruction of liberalism for the 21st century, it requires our attention to institutions that foster modern economic growth, not efforts to engineer modern economic growth. And that's a major aspect of what it is that we need out of the institutions that are required, that we detail it throughout the book. Okay. So what is our theoretical contribution? This is a picture of me and the co-author of Rosolino at the introduction of the book at the API meetings in Guatemala that we just went to. But what are the contributions of the book? The first one is that institutions matter for the wealth and poverty of nations and for the freedom and liberty of individuals. It's institutions that determine whether or not we can give it a go in our economic life, but also to live free and responsible lives as individuals in the society. We need institutions that are embed freedom of contract, private sanctity of private property, all embedded in the rule of law. We use a quote. This might be something we could talk about because it relates to the current effort. So if I go back a page, you might say these populist efforts were all directed at the 20th century totalitarian and economic technocracy. And there is some truth to that. But in the United States, at least, this populism is also fueled by a nativism, which is anti-immigration. It's also fueled by the idea that we need to reestablish our manufacturing base rather than a service industry that has taken off. And therefore, what we're going to do is use tariffs and other kind of policies to recreate the flyover states industrial base in the United States. That's part of the story there, of that idea. Um, and so there's a real serious issue there having to do with what are those institutions of freedom, and liberalism is under question. Someone like a Patrick Deneen argues that liberalism failed because it doesn't have a teleology, and it doesn't have a single purpose to it, and as a result, we've lost that identity in our country. But for a liberal, we've never had that. The key issue about liberalism is that it's not ends related; it's in fact means related. We interact means wise, not ends wise, which means we don't have a teleology. People have teleologies, but not the society doesn't. Anyway, we can maybe talk about that some. Entrepreneurship is filtered by the on the ground operating rules of the social game we are playing, and the rules in the market co evolve through time. So we have to move in a direction to study endogenous rule formation rather than just exogenous rules. All right, so how does this affect? This is a sub theme of the book: is how does it affect the teaching of economics, which is why we wanted to publish the book with UFM. If you read this cartoon carefully, what it is two economists, and he's pointing to this thing. Then a miracle occurs. So, right, this is the equivalent of boop, like this, and then you circle around the inflection point, and then you don't have an answer, right? It's just a miracle happens. That's not what we can do. We have to explain that very transformation, not leave it unexplained. It's the transformation that has to be our focus. It's that question which drives us. And our argument in the book is that this requires us to think about property rights economics, applied price theory economics, and political economy. It also, in studying property rights, price theory, and political economy, we have to recognize that these things all take place within an institutional foundation that is established by ethics, law, politics, and social mores. So ethics and moral conventions have to be part of our study as economists. We can't just treat economic life as in a vacuum. We have to instead focus our energies on this institutional infrastructure and its role in development. And how do we study that? We study it by looking at how alternative institutional arrangements either enable or hinder the pursuit of productive specialization and the realization of peaceful social cooperation through exchange. This theme about productive specialization and peaceful social cooperation through exchange is repeated again and again inside of the pages of this book. The reason is that it's a Buchanan line, which is that you have to have various iterations of an argument to force a alien argument on reluctant minds. And so we are trying to establish this idea. For those of you who are very steeped in Austrian economics, this is really chapter 7 of Human Action, which is about human society and the role of what Mises called Ricardo's law of association. For those who are not steeped in Austrian economics, I recommend reading that chapter or reading our book, and you will get that line. So the wealth and poverty of nations, it turns on getting property rights right. And this is what I was going to mention about these institutions. So, and the populist challenge. So as you can see, this populist outlash. So in 1979, Milton Friedman went to China and they said, Professor Friedman, what should we do? And he said, privatize, privatize, privatize. In recent months, as in the United States, Elon Musk and others have followed Malay's demonstration effect by using the chainsaw metaphor and holding up a chainsaw. They're going to chainsaw all the inefficient government and everything like that. But in the process of doing it, they have not followed normal legislative procedures, all right, which has caused a backlash here. And the reason why I bring this up is that Milton Friedman in 2002, from the sort of pro-Trump side, there's been lots of videos circulating of Milton Friedman saying in the 1980s when they would ask him, Professor Friedman, what about the Department of Education? / what about the Department of, EPA / stuff, the chainsaw, right, kind of idea. And anyway, so Friedman in 2002 was asked, Professor Friedman, have we learned anything from the long and difficult transitions from socialism? And he says, yes. And would you change your prescription? And he said, yes. I would say privatize, 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 provided there's a rule of law. That changes the entire dynamic of everything. It means that you must follow the rule of law, not the rule of men. You can't engage in such discretionary practices. We can't trust that the extraordinary man can stand outside of the system in extraordinary times and fix things. That's a very Carl Schmittian idea of the extraordinary man and the extraordinary circumstances. Instead, what we must do is work within the system to change the system, within the rule of law, to establish and reestablish the rule of law. And it's a more difficult process. But the countries that do that are the ones that end up by having more sustainable reforms. So the wealth and poverty of nations turns on getting property rights right. Property rights right. Okay. So what are the enduring lessons from the book? I would argue markets thrive under liberty, institutions emerge spontaneously, all right, and that economic history teaches us usable lessons that we should, in fact, our empirical aspects of our study as economists should be as economic historians, not necessarily exclusively as statisticians. We can use descriptive statistics very usefully. We can engage in statistical analysis to make sure we're not dealing with spurious correlations. But at the same time, what we really need to do is study in depth and in detail the institutions that make up economic history and their acceptability, their enforcement, and whatnot. Okay, so the final takeaway. Liberty leads to exchanges. Exchanges lead to prosperity. That leads to an institutional feedback, which gives us greater liberty and allows us to have larger exchanges and therefore realize greater expansion of trade. And so this is what economic growth is, this upward movement towards prosperity and progress. Ideas, the McCloskey notion, ideas either raise or lower the cost of implementing and complying with those institutions of liberty. So if my belief system is such that I don't value liberty, the enforcement costs of trying to respect liberty will be prohibitive. So I need to lower that cost so that I don't need a preacher and a policeman on every corner to respect property and contract and consent. So ideas are crucial. Ideas of liberty plus the institutions of liberty is what gives us human progress in the arts, in science, and in commerce. All right. And that's in bold because that is the core idea. That's the historical path to liberty and human progress, is that it's the ideas of liberty plus the institutions of liberty that give rise to the exchange and production activity, which results in human progress in the arts and in science and in commerce. And so human progress on all margins rises due to the expansion of the wealth of nations. As Manuel Ayala put it, enforcement of property rights fosters a peaceful and voluntary societies. We must have property rights enforced, and those property rights have to be the right ones. Okay. All right. That is the end of my formal talk. I think I did that in 40 minutes. So now I'm more than willing to entertain any questions anyone has for the remainder of the time.
Thank you very much, Professor, for such a wonderful presentation. I think we're all looking forward to reading the book. And yes, this is a time for questions. So if anyone has any, you can use the Q&A section. And Nico, of course, if you want to ask anything, that would be wonderful as well. So I have one here. I will share it with you. It says, if liberalism has such a compelling historical record, lifting millions out of poverty, expanding prosperity and dignity, why has it failed to capture the cultural imagination? Why does the left still dominate the narrative in the arts, media, and education? Is
The
it
great
because liberalism became too focused on economic reasoning and lost its rhetorical, even poetic power, something that Adam Smith, with his moral and philosophical style, never neglected?
Okay, so great question. And there's multi levels of this. So one of them is a more practical one of today, which I think is relates to what the last part of. But I think there's something deeper. So let me start with the deeper one and then come to the next one, which is the deeper one is Hayek offered the following suggestion, and it seems to be suggested as well in the work of Joseph Heinrich and other more recent cultural anthropologists. And that is that evolutionary anthropologists. That is that we as human beings rose up as social beings in small groups, and we have small group norms that are hardwired into us, and those tend to be in-group norms. All right. So in honor of the Pope, let me give an example of early Christian communities. That's in the book of Acts, right? So the Christians were persecuted after the death of Christ. And so they formed these little small little enclaves that protected themselves. And there's a famous example of a couple that actually didn't follow the social norms, and so they were going to have to be ostracized. This is in the book of Acts. And part of it was that they had communal property in this small group. And these individuals were greedy, and that's why they get kicked out. So the question is that, so we tend to think of these small, social, intimate orders as having these kind of communal rights, communal responsibility, these kind of issues. But you can't expand, just like it's corrupting to take the norms from the outside and bring them into the community, the small community. It's also impossible to take the communal rights and expand them to get the society. They're appropriate for an intimate order. So our hardwired moral intuitions are at odds with the moral demands of the great society. So we have the intimate order and the extended order, and our moral intuitions are for the intimate order. But in order to realize the great benefits of division of labor, we engage in the extended order, and those same norms don't translate. And so what we need to do is actually spend a lot of time talking about the ethics, the legal, political, and social mores that are associated with the great society. So in the ultimate goal, what we want to do is have strangers nowhere in the world, all right, which is to break down the barriers of nativism. We engage in cosmopolitan liberalism. It's what Peter Boettke, the great sociologist, referred to it as you need to have a cosmopolitan imam, which is that on your block, you can have a imam and a priest and a rabbi, and they don't fight with each other. They just hang out and, go in their own directions, and no one gets freaked out about it at all, right? And rather than them siloing themselves off in this regard. And so we have to have this kind of world and cultivate this. What Hayek referred to it as is we need to have a more mature mind, In a book criticizing liberalism as a failed but noble ideal, this is Martha Nussbaum, the philosopher. In her chapters on Adam Smith, she says Smith required us to be too stoic in the face of human suffering. And so, all right. So anyway, the bottom line is therefore a lot of the ideas that are associated with the left are associated with the norms of the intimate order. They want the norms of the intimate order, but they want the material benefits of the extended order. And those two things clash with each other. Okay. Now, second point, which is the more relevant one, which is why have we lost out in recent years? So a very good example of this is that in 2015, it was the first time in human history that less than 10% of the world's population was living in extreme poverty. Just like wrap that around your head. First time in human history. When I was a student, it was closer to 80%, or excuse me, 40%. When Mises and Hayek were walking around, it was closer to 80%, right, of the world was living in extreme poverty. 40% in the 1980s when I was learning economics, now under 10% when you're learning economics. But does that ever get celebrated in your classes? I mean, unless you have an Austrian economist or a free market economist, you're probably never even going to hear about it, right? In fact, if anything, you're going to hear about neoliberalism and all this stuff and how the world's poor are crucified on the cross of the IMF and the World Bank and WTO and blah 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 and all this stuff, right? By the way, I'm not advocating for the WTO, the World Bank, or the IMF. I'm just saying that this sort of neoliberal narrative is the dominant narrative, and it seems to resonate with people. All right. And they buy into it. Now, that shouldn't be the case because in 1989, we saw all of the socialist regimes collapse from their own weight. And the archives, when they were opened up, revealed these regimes to be even more brutal than we had done. So it wasn't that the documents of their brutality prior were actually overstating how terrible these regimes were. They were, in fact, underestimating how terrible they were. And so, the low estimates of deaths by government actually had to get rejected, and the high estimates are what were even sometimes underestimated. All right. So, and then in the 1990s, let me throw even a little bit more into this, which is in the 1990s, all the Scandinavian countries went through massive fiscal reforms because they faced the problem of depopulation in the wake of an expanding welfare state. So they had to go through massive fiscal changes and deregulation stories. You can see this, by the way, by just going to the Economic Freedom Index. So go to the Economic Freedom Index and look at Denmark, look at Finland, look at Sweden, look at any of these places and look at their economic freedom score over time. And you'll be amazed because in your head, you've been told that these are socialist countries. But the reality is they actually have very high economic freedom scores. Okay. All right. So just table that for a side and do that because that, again, is an impression. So what did we do wrong after all this evidence was in our favor? And here's my conjecture. Okay. Is that we forgot that politics is downstream from culture. So when we thought that we had won the battle of ideas after the long fought Cold War, we stopped thinking creatively in economics, in politics, in philosophy, in the arts. All right. I can't say that about commerce because, these things, right? The amazing innovations that have taken place transforming our lives over the last 40 years. But that decision by our main donors, our main intellectuals, has cost us dearly because we ceded the intellectual community to the left. And they were on their heels in 1989. But then by 2001, prior to 2001, when people started to protest globalization, it was already a little bit on the heels. Argentina, by the way, is actually one of the critical things that went wrong. So the currency board experiment in Argentina and Menem and the issues having to do with a neoliberal leader becoming a corrupt leader, that also was true in Prague, in which you had a tremendous advantage in Prague because the Czech Republic was a gateway to Europe. And it was the Paris of the East in many ways. And they had the greatest moral sanction as a new president in Václav Havel, a former dissident, a poet, right? An artist. And then one of the most well-trained economists in Václav Klaus. And they still managed to screw it up with the Pirates of Prague and all these things like that, right? And so the 1990s were not very pretty for the reforms precisely because of public choice reasons. And we didn't pay enough attention to this. And so as a result, since culture is downstream, politics is downstream from culture, if you cede the cultural argument, you end up by being susceptible in early 2000s to the globalization critique, after the financial crisis and gambling with other people's money, right? And unfortunately, rather than pinning those things on the military adventurism of the West, causing the problems in the Middle East, or the crony capitalism that caused the problems in the banking industry, and then COVID and the Great Reset and whatnot, and all of these things have seeded that ground. We didn't have enough experimentation or pushback or resistance during COVID shutdowns, right? From creative and bold intellectuals defending freedom against the tyranny. We had few people, but they weren't like the kind of Robert Nozick type people, right? That could have, or a Hayek or someone like that. And so liberalism lost out in this regard, I think, not because of the Patrick Deneen, we don't have a teleology stuff, but I think it lost out to ceding the higher cultural ground to the left and not addressing what are the necessary ways to shift the ethics, the legal system, the political system, and the social and cultural mores in a direction more towards individual freedom and responsibility. Long-winded answer, but a great question. And I don't know if I answered it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. I have another one. I don't know, Nico, if you want to ask anything, of course, jump in. So here's one more. Your book traces the historical path of liberty and its institutional foundations. But today we are witnessing a revival of pro-liberty rhetoric through figures like Javier Milei in Argentina, yet often mixed with populist, anti-institutional impulses. How should liberals think about this paradox? The rise of liberty in language, but its potential weakening in practice.
So I do not know enough about the details of Milei to make a comment. I do think that at least in rhetoric and the selection bias of the information that comes to me, he is a lot more principled and informed than our populist president in the United States. Now, I do not know, again, details, so maybe you can teach me. But one of the main things about our own situation in the US is that we are making this country more difficult for talented and creative individuals to move here and improve our lives. Okay. And we face a very serious depopulation problem. When after World War II, our population looked like this. Okay. Meaning a lot of people here, baby boom, right? And then what you have is few people that are older. Today, it looks like this. All right. So we're facing this severe depopulation problem. There's only two ways to fix a depopulation problem. One of them is to have a ton of babies. And that doesn't seem to go with the economic progress and whatnot, and economic and opportunities for women in the marketplace. So, and the other is mass immigration. I'm a defender of open borders precisely because I would love it if I had 100,000 students at George Mason University. I think the United States has 300 million people now. I think we could go to 100 million people and not, 800, 900, million people and not have a problem. A billion people. We could have that here. We have so much space and land. I mean, Nixon, Texas, take a ride from Lubbock to Angelo State. Right? That, all you're going to see is like a dust bowl or something like that, right? There could be apartments. There could be, all kinds of productive activity that takes place along that whole way of doing it. And so to me, I think, this is going to sound like a silly example, but last summer when the Olympics were going on, you look at all these wonderful athletes, these great achievers of human greatness. And they were all being educated in the United States, but they were all from all walks of the world. So the guy who wins the pole vault, he's from Sweden, but he's educated at LSU, right? This person is a runner from Ethiopia, but they're running for, USC, and all these kind of things like that. And so you would look at that and you'd say, my God, why wouldn't we want all these wonderful, talented people from all over the world to come here, right? And what we're doing is we're pursuing a kind of nativism, which doesn't make any sense. And it's going to, it cuts against us economically and culturally. And so I'm very nervous about that. I do not know if the same kind of nativism is behind what Malay is saying, or if it's just a criticism of the tyranny of experts. So when I hear him talk, I only hear him criticizing the tyranny of experts, right? But I don't know enough to know if he's going at I guess I know enough that he's conservative Catholic, I think, right? And so he doesn't necessarily like social progress on certain issues that I think are necessary for dissidents to be. I think so here's an interesting thing. If you look at entrepreneurship and you look at social progress on various issues, LGBTQ issues or whatever, right? You're going to see a positive correlation. Why? Because an entrepreneur is a dissident, just very much like a social entrepreneur is a dissident, okay? Because they're doing something that's different that no one else knows. They see the world differently than what you're normally used to. And so I am very, culturally liberal in this regard, because I believe that is the greatest source for our great strength. And so that means that people are going to do things that I don't necessarily like personally, like I wouldn't want to do myself. But I think we must be tolerant of those issues, on religious issues, on social life issues, all that stuff. And the way you're going to be tolerant, by the way, is to have respect for private property and persons, because bodily autonomy is actually one of those things. Freedom of thought, freedom of bodily autonomy is going to be one of those key issues. That puts me at odds with a lot of conservatives. And so I don't know if your current president is playing the same cards that our president is playing. Nick, straighten me out on this one.
I think I'm gonna sidestep that and ask a question.
Yeah.
Any other question on the queue from one of the attendees?
Yes, we can share one more if you
Yes.
agree. There's one from Jorge Streff, who's one of our fellows. He's asking, you mentioned Scandinavian countries. Might their combination of economic liberty and open economies with a social welfare net make the median voter more pro-market, in your view?
So this is what went on in those countries, is that they have a relatively homogeneous population. They're small homogeneous population, which meant, going back to those intimate mores, they were more likely to want to give to others. This is why immigration has been such a challenge to these countries, because now their system is being taxed by people that are different from them, and they fought back. All right. But you're exactly right, whoever asked that question, because what drives their economic freedom issues is their openness in trade. So you go to a country like Sweden, has tremendous open trade, and it's had open trade for a very long time. All right. And they're also innovative societies. That is, they don't curtail innovation. France has so much regulations, they don't have innovation in France. All right. Like many, many years ago, George Bush said something somewhat stupid, but actually very profound, which is France didn't have many innovations in business, and the costs of doing business were quite high. And he said, the problem with the French is they don't have any word for entrepreneurship. French is an entrepreneur is a French word, right? So Bush didn't know that, but he, from his Texas speak, it was, but that's a very profound point, because there hasn't been, like, France is not a dynamic commercial society. It's a wealthy society because it's consuming its accumulated surplus. This is what Mises refers to as the accumulated surplus fund. And some of these countries can erode these accumulated surplus funds over time. And that's what you're seeing in Western Europe, by the way, their welfare states, Italy, all of these places. Their accumulated surplus fund is being eaten into by their welfare states. But you can, as the question puts it, you can have a vibrant, open, entrepreneurial economy and then decide that you need to have second cousin Sven taken care of, right? And you can have like a universal basic income or some kind of other welfare system. Hayek was a little bit more open to this than Mises, but I even think in Hayek's case, what you have to do is read Mises's review of Hayek's Constitutional Liberty. He says he brilliantly lays out the principles in the first half of the book to only give them away in the second half of the book, right? That's Mises's argument. But what Hayek was doing was actually quite brilliant, which is that those principles at the time that he wrote in the 1950s were considered outside of the reasonable set. To hold those principles would be to consider yourself Manchesterism and, outside the reasonable set. So what Hayek does in the Constitutional Liberty in the second part is he says, okay, this general principle can be summed up in one simple rule, which is, in that time, it was the rule of law, but later he would refer to it as generality. No law can be passed which isn't passed for everyone else. Now he says, I'm going to sift through the welfare state and see what aspects of the welfare state can still pass through the generality norm. All right? And that's what he does. And he makes these concessions to the welfare state. Socialism can't pass through the generality norm, but various different welfare programs can, as long as they're universal. Right? That's the key issue. They're not particular benefits to particular groups, but they pass through a generality norm. All right. Congress shall pass no law that benefits one group without also benefiting all other groups. All right. Now, work all these policies through it. So it's brilliant because what Hayek did was he made liberalism now back in the reasonable set. And then that made possible people that wanted to push the boundaries further, right? Which is then the next generation of thinkers like a Nozick or someone like that. Because now you're back in the reasonable set. If there was no Hayek and all you had was, say, Ayn Rand or someone like that, those ideas would never be in the reasonable set. And as a result, you wouldn't be able to be a professor at Harvard, for example, and be able to hold and push the boundaries of those ideas. So we need to figure out the policies that are neither discriminatory nor relations of domination, and then stick with those two things. That's the Republican notion of freedom. We can live with that one as a libertarian or as a liberal. All right. We're going to have non-discriminatory politics, non-domination relations in politics. And now let's push everything through that lens. And what can we have? So Nick knows this. Not all of you know it, but I published a book not that long ago, with one of Nick's former colleagues, Dan Smith, on money and the rule of law. And we try to look through monetary policy from the strict standards of the rule of law. I myself am a free banker. But in that book, we're talking about central banks. So I was trying to see, is there a way to square the circle with regard to central banks? That is, bind them so that they just follow policy through the rule of law. Can they operationalize like that kind of policies? So that's the way that we're thinking about that. And I have another book, which is called Public Administration, a Classical Liberal Perspective, with Paul Alagica, that does a similar exercise for public administration more broadly. So, yeah.
Very well. So we have one more, one last question, if you have the time, Professor.
I'll try to be brief. I know I've pushed you beyond your limit.
No, that's okay. But so it's from Leonardo Litvak. He's asking, in Argentina, people are gradually beginning to understand the costs associated with the public sector. However, the costs generated by rent seeking in many private sector activities and professions are much harder to explain and communicate, mainly because the immediate short-term short-term costs of changing such structures. Additionally, even among those who are open to reform, there is often a reluctance to begin with sectors where they themselves benefit from extraordinary gains. Are there examples of other countries that have managed to undergo a transition in this regard?
So, first off, the way to explain this mechanism is called the fiscal commons. That is that when you ever separate the revenue decision from the expenditure decision, you're going to create wrong incentives for spending. Okay. I mentioned very briefly the currency board situation in Argentina. That was broken by imprudent fiscal policy, right? That's what caused the problem. Monetary policy had been exported. So it wasn't a monetary policy. It was the regional governors who did not get their fiscal house in order. And as a result, they were either confronted with not being able to meet up their obligations or break the currency board so they could monetize the debt. And what did they choose to do? They screwed it all up, right? And so Nico can tell you more about that than I can, and all of that. But this fiscal commons is a serious problem that must be confronted. Now the question is that, so the first thing is you have to institutionally tie the revenue decision and the expenditure decision. Second, I think I think economics is not a tool of social control, but it's a tool of social understanding. And so in our job as economists, if we are going to do social understanding, we are either being philosophers reflecting on a contemporary existing practice. The butcher, the baker, and the brewer did not invent your dinner. The dinner was already on the table. Adam Smith's trying to explain how it is that dinner ended up on the table. He's a philosopher of the mundane, the everyday occurrence, and trying to explain the mystery of that mundane. But we can also be social critics. That is, do your means, are they consistent with the ends that you seek? Okay? So this is one of the reasons that, we were mentioning earlier about Pope Francis. One of the problems with Pope Francis is that he had certain policy lofty goals that he hoped humanity could achieve. The means by which he chose which he advocated to achieve those goals are incongruent with those goals. So as a result, there was always going to be disappointment between the aspiration and the reality, right? And the reality can't just get explained on greedy capitalist pigs. It actually was that the socialist kind of policies and advocacies of social justice are not consistent with the achievement of actual social justice. They instead condemn people to poverty. Okay, so that we can also do as economists. And so to me, I think this is our critical thing, is to expose the rent seeking, to distance it from the nature of laissez-faire capitalism, to expose crony capitalism, to identify what is previously unseen is now going to be seen. And part of that unseen is that the long-term costs of those short-term benefits that are concentrated. And so this is the key issue, right? Is that you have a concentrated benefit on the well-organized and well-informed, and you're dispersing the costs on the unorganized and ill-informed in the long run. We as economists have to expose that unintended long-term consequences of these short-term issues. And so we cannot let short-term relief undermine long-term economic growth. And so that's the big message at the end of the day here. We will achieve our goals for a social betterment by maximizing economic growth. That's a good way to end.
That's perfect. Okay, so thank you very much, Professor, for your time. This has been an honor, very, very interesting. And thank you, everyone, for joining today. Nico, I don't know if you want to say something else.
I don't know. I want to thank Pete, of course, and all the attendees. Thank you for your time, and I hope everyone else to see you in our next Freedom Perspectives. I think it's next week with Carlos Rodriguez Brown. So hopefully I'll see you online again.
Okay, that's awesome. And thank you very much. And I appreciate all the effort you guys are going to have this conversation with people. And we definitely need it all throughout the world. So I hope that your efforts are mimicked.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.